Hi, my name is Nora Olsen. I'm with the University of Idaho. I'm a potato specialist located in southern Idaho, and I was asked to talk about tips for storing compromised potatoes. Now, I know this sounds academic, but it's always really important to keep in mind the objectives or goals of storage, what we can and cannot change, because this can help us understand that what we do change in order to deal with diseased potatoes, what are some of the consequences of those? So some of these goals we're dealing with is respiration and how we're going to handle that higher respiration in storage. We're trying to provide humidity to minimize evaporation or water losses from those potatoes. We really need fresh air. We need to remove CO2 or carbon dioxide. And we also, and I think we're going to talk about this quite a bit, is removing heat and maintaining then those desired temperatures. But some of these other things that we have to deal with are drying out wet potatoes or diseased potatoes, preventing additional spread of disease in storage and additional breakdown, avoiding condensation. There's a lot going on, a lot of water being given off with diseased potatoes or compromised potatoes. And then this is always a big question, is that you're dealing with your suboptimal or your compromised potatoes, but what are then the consequences of the sound ones, the ones that you still are usable and are going to get paid on? Eugenia was kind enough to send me some photographs from this year and give me a little bit of update on what you guys have been dealing with. So sorry that you had to battle late blight, never an easy one out in the field, and then the opportunity that it takes for two-bird blight and going into storage, never an easy one to deal with. But she also sent me some other photographs. Unfortunately, you also had the exposure of higher temperatures at harvest. That's never an easy one as well. Add that on to a late blight year, then the potential for Pythium leak, potential for pink rot. She showed me that you had a little bit of Pectobacterium or soft rot coming in. And so this definitely makes a good mix or complexity of a lot of diseases, and especially ones that are going to break down pretty quickly in storage for you. And you're not given the opportunities for outside air to help you and the environment to help you in these situations. Now in Idaho, we do, in some years, battle late blight. For the last many years, we have our late blight years, and then we have a lot of years that we don't, just due to our arid environments. So some of my comments today are going to be based upon when we did those late blight years that we did experience, also based upon, hey, the additional research that we put into place to look at how we're going to handle late blight in storage. But a couple diseases that we routinely battle each year is Pythium leak and pink rot. Both the ones are notorious for coming up with in our warmer harvest seasons, and variety dependent, weather dependent, all of these things. But this is ones that we have spent quite a bit of time doing research on. And so when we start talking about compromised potatoes, we're often alluding to how to handle Pythium leak or how to handle pink rot, either in the field, at harvest, or in storage. Now, it may have been a couple years since we've had a late blight year, but in 2019, we had tremendous frost in a lot of our areas in Idaho. This was challenging, but to look at the positive of all of it, it was insightful on really how to handle goo, how to handle breakdown, how to handle those compromised potatoes. So again, some of my comments will be threaded through this conversation today will be based upon what did we do with those compromised potatoes in storage. Now, based upon that frost year that we recently had, we designed some recommendations. So these are recommendations that we came up for frost, but many of these would be the same for wet rot disease, except for maybe adding a lot more of a focus on temperature, which we'll talk about. But let's kind of go through this a little bit. One, airflow. Airflow you're dealing with if you really are having true breakdown, like as you do of a frost or a wet rot, right? You can maximize your outside air, opportunities that you have with that, periodically closing off ducts to the good potatoes, using duct or grain fans for additional air in certain areas, additional pile fans and heaters. So really what you're dealing with in this situation is condensation management. As we mentioned, there's a lot of water already being given off by especially frosted potatoes, but again, rotting potatoes are giving off water that then becomes a condensation management issue. artificially increase return air with heaters, increase that fresh air, and then cutting back on humidity. Now I put an asterisk next to this, really, especially when we start talking about certain diseases, that how much do you want to cut back on that? Because it goes to that second column right here, the consequences of good potatoes. Now obviously this is a huge balance. You start cutting back humidity and you're losing weight loss from the sound potatoes. But if this is how you're going to be able to keep them from spreading and further breakdown, then obviously that's a decision you've got to make. So what about the second thing, the second kind of column that we have, are ranked storages? Really going in with a plan, prioritize and plan, and knowing that that plan can shift, not knowing exactly how these potatoes are going to respond in storage, but at least having an idea of what percentage of disease or late blight, pink rot, pythium, whatever you got going in, or that you're starting to see in storage, and the logistics of the storage conditions or the systems and the plant and how that works. And so we'll talk about that next too, and your building capabilities. So can't talk about this enough. Consequences of good potatoes and knowing what the risks are with those good potatoes, and really coming up with a reasonable outcome by month. And these things are compromised. So really, what's your best guess? What's going to happen? What can you do? And realizing again that might shift from month to month, not knowing what's going to happen with certain outcomes and certain storages. And manage for your best profit. I think this is really important too. Is that what's your reasonable outcome and what is the best profit that you can get in this situation? And really to be realistic. You're going to be told that, hey, you can do X, Y, Z in storage, maybe apply certain products or this or that, but you really just need to be realistic in the situation of what you can and cannot do. And again, going back to those objectives, what can we control in storage? What are our options? Well, we've got ventilation, we've got temperature control, and we've got humidity control, and that's pretty much what we've got. And so using those to the best that we can is really important in this situation. Now, one thing that the frost did teach us is management decisions based upon, are all those potatoes in that bay compromised? Are you under one ventilation system? You can make a lot of changes in that because they're all compromised. So you're just trying to save that bin and do the best that you can with those potatoes. But what if you have to make decisions based upon a single bay with one ventilation system and not everything's diseased? Only half of it. Maybe you got a different variety in there that's not susceptible to tuber blight, whatever it is. Maybe they came in different fields. And so this becomes a little bit more complex. How are you going to manage this? How are you going to manage those diseased potatoes and still, again, try to deal with the ones that are not? You're also going to have management decisions based upon if it's a split bay storage system, one ventilation system. And you can see on this side that there's a lot more water coming off that frosted side or that compromised side running out of the ducts than it is on the other side. And so again, these are decisions that if you're going to start reducing humidity in the system, is that yes, good decision for the bay on the left, but not necessarily on the right, or at least you got to realize what is realistic for those potatoes on the right, that they are going to receive lower humidity. So again, just wanted to bring this up is that you're making decisions and it's easy for us to say, hey, reduce humidity or reduce temperatures, but what about in this situation? Or if you've got really great processing potatoes on the right-hand side, you don't want to necessarily drop temperatures too low to deal with the ones on the left-hand side. So again, it becomes very complex, but be aware of how you're putting them into storage and have a good plan in case situations like this arise. Because you're really trying to avoid situations like this to the best that you can, that not all of them are breaking down, and that you at least can try to have some profitable potatoes out of that storage. So let's specifically talk about late blight and storage. Well, we know that cultivars vary in susceptibility. And I think that's really key in terms of not only susceptibility out in the field in terms of foliar blight, but they also vary in terms of tuber blight. So knowing that risk of that cultivar is going to be important. Obviously, we're well into the storage season. Don't want to go back in time because I'm sure you don't need to hear about it. But obviously, controlling the field and what you can do out there. But let's specifically talk about storage. Well, avoiding warm pulp temperatures and wounding and wet conditions. These are the three major areas that we can try to reduce that risk of late blight spreading in storage and then being compromised and having soft rot follow in afterwards and breaking down. Eliminate when loading. Going into storage can also be helpful. Minimizing also too the amount of dirt and debris in the cellar makes a huge difference too, because you can figure that you don't need any more clogging up of that air. You need most of the air that you can get into there as much as possible. So we talk about removing field heat quickly, and this becomes a little bit more difficult because if it's already warm outside for harvest, unless you're under refrigeration or situations like that, it becomes a little bit more difficult on how you're going to get that field heat out of there. Now we can talk a lot about temperatures at this point. Obviously, cooler temperatures are better in terms of even deciding on cooler, a little bit on the cooler range of curing temperatures can be more effective too. But I also know that you guys are chip growers or a lot of chip growers in your area, this becomes a little bit more difficult in that balance of decision making in terms of having the fry color that you need, the chip color that you need, and trying to save that crop and making sure that it's not continuing to break down in storage. So always a difficult one there on temperature decisions, but just know lower temperatures are better. Immediate air, high ventilation rates, lower holding temperatures. And then there are post-harvest products that you can use going into storage. Some also can be used in storage. And we often give the recommendation to harvest between 7 and 18 degrees Celsius. But those lines, when you get to them, are not absolute. They really are what we call squiggly lines. So in some situations, you start harvesting above 18 degrees, the greater the risk for disease development, right? Really, our lower temperatures of 7 degrees and lower is much more for bruise management, shatter bruise, and black spot bruise. But this higher risk at the higher temperatures, but these lines are squiggly, meaning that even though you hit 18, in certain situations, certain varieties may be more susceptible to disease breakdown. You may not have the capacity in storage to handle potatoes that are that warm, and then also throw in there that you're dealing with potential late blight, tuber late blight, or even pythium or pink rot, then all of a sudden you may need to think about the risk may be even higher, even if you haven't reached that 18 degrees. So keep in mind, these are not absolutes. Every situation, that ideal range of harvest temperatures need to be identified, and just understand the risk that you're seeing if you are below or higher than that range. Now taking another look at pink rot and how we handle some of that situation is we definitely focus on pulp temperatures at harvest. So we've done a lot of research at the University of Idaho, along with Miller Research, looking at the effect of the incidence of pink rot, whether these potatoes are at cooler temperatures or warmer temperatures at harvest, or if they're wounded or not. And one of the biggest things that you can see right here is that, hey, warmer temperatures, the bigger bars, are going to give you greater incidence or potential, let's just say, for pink rot. If they're wounded or not, the black bars, you can see that makes a big difference. At your warmer temperatures, whether they're wounded or not, they're at a greater risk for pink rot development. But if you are at a little bit lower temperatures, you have the potential that if you're not wounding them, your risk of pink rot dramatically goes down. Pythium leek is another one, known to avoid high pulp temperatures. Well, what does that really mean in terms of those harvest and handling conditions? Well, one of the first things about Pythium leek is the potential for the incidence of this to increase with each incremental increase in temperature, pulp temperatures, and those early storage temperatures. So ranging from 13 to 21 degrees C, you see this perfect nice line increasing. So as you increase in temperature, your risk of Pythium leek increases. So be aware of that in terms of making decision making, in terms of when you're going to stop harvesting, and again, what you can handle in storage. But also on the left-hand side shows us that, hey, some varieties are more susceptible than others to Pythium leek. And this really goes back to those squiggly lines of when you can harvest, or that range that we recommend for harvest, is that, hey, some varieties should not be harvested above 18, or maybe it should be even 16 degrees C, just based upon because they are more susceptible to a certain disease. So keep this in mind. Stressing knowing pulp temperatures going in, not only necessarily for knowing when to shut off your harvesters, but also just knowing your risk of your disease development and storage, but also how to manage that crop. You're really going to need those pulp temperatures to know, hey, what should our set points be at? How are we going to manage this and make some decisions with the crop in storage? Eugenia was kind enough to send me this picture of Jessica Vanderzag with her harvest pulp temperatures. Love this. This makes my heart pitter-patter to see this, because you can gain a tremendous amount of information knowing what those pulp temperatures are, keeping the crop under certain temperatures, knowing that you can handle that crop in storage, knowing your capacity of your storage and what you can deal with that warmer crop. So good job, Jessica. Really appreciate seeing this slide. Now that we're loading potatoes into storage, what are some of the things that we can do after dealing with harvest and handling and temperatures and make some decisions on that? Now, the current industry recommendations, let's just say, about putting potatoes into storage is, one, you're going to remove field heat immediately. And there's a lot of different reasons for this, right? Then we're going to cure those potatoes from 10 to, let's just say, 13 degrees for 2 to 3 weeks. And then we're going to ramp those potatoes down to their holding temperatures. Well, what's really important is that we start talking about curing for that 2 to 3 weeks. Always remember that removing field heat, that part of this recommendation, is part of that curing process. And also start thinking about that ramp and how those warmer temperatures also contribute to that curing. So what are we trying to do during this time? Getting back to your objectives of curing and why we're holding at warmer temperatures is to heal up those wounds, right? In terms of minimizing entry for fusarium and soft rot and other diseases, as well as then to minimize weight loss. So once we're done with that, we don't need to be at these warmer temperatures, especially when we have compromised potatoes in storage. So keep early temperatures in mind and how we can get these down, not at the consequence for your chipping color, but also just in terms of not holding them too long at these warmer temperatures for fear of having any more breakdown due to diseases in the storage building. This is especially important when you're maybe harvesting at warmer temperatures. Coming out of the field, they're warm. Theoretically, if you put them in storage, then you really don't have any cooling air outside. Just if we calculate it based upon the heat of respiration, because respiration generates quite a bit of energy or heat in the form of heat, that 18 degrees C can turn into 21 degrees after about 12 hours. Just this re-emphasizes the importance of getting air on those potatoes, that having that finite line of 18 degrees and cutting off at that time. And if you can't get those potatoes cooled down, that temperature in that pile can increase even more, so make it even more difficult to try to cool these potatoes down. So keep in mind that not only the temperature of the potatoes coming into the cellar, is that how do you have the ability to continue to cool those down and start to get a hold of that temperature and control. This may mean using refrigeration, maximizing any available cooling air that you can. Pythium leak is also a very watery type of disease to have in storage. Humidity management, obviously when we start talking about disease in storage, is really important, but what about the water coming off the decaying crop itself too? So to demonstrate how much water really comes off these decaying potatoes, or these potatoes that are breaking down, here's an example with a frost example, but it would be similar to what you'd see in Pythium leak, is that over 24 hours, one potato that's about a 6-ounce potato will give us about a shot glass full of water. So you start adding this up, how many potatoes you have in there, knowing the percentage of disease you have, and then again, how much water is coming off of them. So it becomes another management decision. Not only are you trying to deal with this breakdown of these potatoes and what's happening in terms of the actual disease development, but you're also dealing with a lot of water. And we've got to be able to exhaust that and get it out of the building to be able to help dry out that crop. Now this water is coming off these decaying potatoes, but you also have just a huge complexity or diversity of environments within this pile. So it's hard to always get a grasp of what is the temperature, what is the humidity in the individual spots, especially if you've got some compromised or diseased potatoes. But just know that there is this dynamic that's occurring, and keep this in mind in terms that interaction between temperature and humidity is very strong. Your ventilation is your lifeblood to this whole storage situation, right? And so one, make sure you have adequate ventilation to what you wanted, especially deliver the air the system was designed to deliver. So meaning that the ducts are aligned and sealed, your static pressure is not too high, all those things. Primarily because if a hot spot is developing, you want to ensure that it does have at least some airflow down below. You don't want to then see later on that, hey, look, the duct holes were pointed to the floor or something like that. So this is very important to make sure everything's aligned, because this is your lifeblood to helping your crop in storage. You also want to look at your desired delta T. That's obviously varies with what kind of disease pressure you have in the storage, what you need to accomplish with that. So you can play with your delta T's, meaning the difference in temperature between the bottom and the top of the pile, on how you need to maybe dry out the pile and handle any kind of extreme disease issue. With compromised potatoes, hotspot management is pretty critical. Ventilation, targeted ventilation or targeted air in those situations can be helpful. Trying to avoid them to continue to get any bigger than they are. Continue on with your typical practices that you do in terms of monitoring your storages, looking for any depressions, temperature changes, any odor that you're seeing. This will help you stay proactive in terms of any hot spots that are developing or getting larger. And it also helps you make some decisions on, hey, we need to maybe move this part of the pile or the whole storage building. So anytime you have compromised potatoes, whether it's from late blight, soft rot, or Pythium leak, you're always worried about the secondary infection from soft rot. So one thing about soft rot is that it is more sensitive to temperature. So anytime you can get those temperatures down, it would be beneficial in terms of trying to reduce that risk of soft rot development or soft rot infection coming in after the primary infection occurred. So research that has been shown in the past is that soft rot is sensitive to that temperature. So anything below like 16 degrees C, let's just say, the multiplication of that pathogen is less than it is at a greater than 16. We also see this with 10 degrees C. We talk about that a lot with fresh potatoes and trying to get that below that in terms of soft rot. So what it essentially is saying is that any ability to try to cool those potatoes gives you some sort of ability to try to combat against soft rot. And airflow, ventilation is your absolute friend in all these cases. Again, trying to ensure that you can get things to be dried out if you are dealing with some sort of wet rot breakdown. Graduate student many years ago even just looked at the effect of just exposure to air. Now this would be kind of on the drier side of air, and the viability of a certain pathogen on the surface of the potato, right? So we have late blight, dry rot, silver scurf, and soft rot. So a known amount is put on these potatoes. And let's see what happens over the course of just a little bit of time. So this is at time 0. They have 100% of what they're going to have. And this is just sitting on the surface, right? So after 30 minutes, if you have the ability to have some exposure to air, your soft rot organism, the viability of that decreases down to 30%. You lose 70% of that organism right there just by drying. 1 hour, you're down to 10% of that soft rot organism sitting there. Late blight, you're actually starting to be able to dry up a little bit, and down to 2 hours. Now this is just theoretical, sitting on the surface of the potato, all of that, but it really stresses the ability of air to help you in situations, especially with soft rot, to be able to dry that out. Now again, this was non-humidified air. So what are some additional options in storage? Well, you can reduce humidification. And we already talked a little bit about that you start to make those decisions based upon how much you have in there, what is the breakdown, how much water is already being given off, all of those things. And so that really is a decision that is always storage by storage, game day decisions. Now ventilation, obviously you're maximizing your run time. You can increase your airflow, have your, VFDs at maximum. You can also do supplemental fans, like I said, grain fans at the entry to the duct. Some people will have them up in the pile, pointed at the hot spot. And then some people have felt that spot treating with a post-harvest product while they're in storage can be effective. And that is going to be case-by-case situation on what you're trying to deal with. This is an example of some research we did several years ago, looking at what is the impact of early storage management on the potential for soft rot infection on potatoes that were already infected with either late blight or pink rot. And what we saw here is that if we were able to reduce the humidity to 80% versus 95%, let's just say, reduce that curing temperature to 10 degrees instead of 12.8 or 13 degrees C, is that we were able to shift and see less soft rot infection of those potatoes that were already infected with late blight or pink rot. So we feel that this is a potential recommendation in terms of handling to try to minimize that soft rot infection. So what you're seeing is that we're playing with some of the basics that we talked about. We're playing with temperature and we're playing with humidity. And obviously we just talked about the importance of ventilation on soft rot development as well. Now this is just an example of a photo from that trial. And just so you can get a representation of how that spread occurred, the potatoes that were infected with either late blight or pink rot were actually they were only in that mesh bag and then surrounded by healthy potatoes. So this gives a good indication of how these disease organisms spread, not only the disease itself, but also the soft rot organism. Now to go back before storage even occurred and to look at some of those recommendations that would occur is to look at those post-harvest applications going into storage. And in particular, because again, we're dealing with two situations here. One are potatoes that are already rotting out in the field. So how do we handle those in storage? But we're also worried about that they are essentially gooing onto healthy potatoes. So how do we make sure those healthy potatoes don't become infected? Well, those are the things that we just talked about in terms of ventilation, temperature, making some decisions on humidity, all of that, making some management decisions and priorities. But are there other things that we can do? Well, one of those things are using the phosphite products going into storage. And we often refer to them as phos acids. Now there is a lot of setup to having these types of application and ensuring that you have the proper application or the amount of volume of product on the potatoes. So here's just an example of what those volumes look like on a potato. They are barely wet. And this is by the circle of about 1/2 gallon per ton, which is what the target application volume is. If they're shiny wet or starting to get too wet, that is too much. And so be aware of what these potatoes look like in terms of that phosphite application in order to have it targeted appropriately. Now we've done a tremendous amount of research looking at the phosphites on the incidence of late blight in storage. Many other people have. It's become a universal type of product to use in these situations, but I just want to show you some of that data that has been generated. And the ones that are indicated by the yellow bars or even no bar are the phosphite applications. So again, these are protecting those healthy potatoes that we have, and that targeted labeled rate of 12.8 fluid ounces per ton is very effective in terms of protecting those healthy potatoes from becoming infected with late blight. So in summary, late blight management and storage, well, it's integrated two-pronged approach, right? One, you're dealing with the field infected potatoes, the ones that are actually breaking down, coming into storage. And then your second pronged approach is to minimize the spread and the breakdown to healthy potatoes in storage. So some of those things that we talked about are obviously variety and exclusion. That's already been dealt with. Those pulp temperatures play a huge role in this in terms of overall temperature management up front in terms of how much these potatoes are under those warmer temperatures. Obviously, again, you've got to balance that with the crop that's in there and maintaining the healthy chip color that you need. But wounding also makes a big difference. Ventilation practices are your friend here. Working with humidity, working to your advantage to help dry out potatoes, understanding that and the influence that can have on the rest of the crop, and then utilizing post-harvest products. So this really is an integrated approach. There's things that you can do at harvest, early time in storage, and then obviously managing the crop and making sure that your expectations are being met throughout the whole storage season.